Welcome, everyone, to episode 27 of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. Today, you're going to hear from my friend Dan Bornstein, who is a former faculty member at the Citadel and currently working for himself at DBornsteinSolutions, LLC. We talked a lot about physical fitness and how lack of physical fitness is becoming a national security risk, not just for the military, but also for fire and for law enforcement. So give it a listen. And if you are so inclined, a rating and a share with someone that you know. Thank you and have a great day. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast, where today I am sitting down with my friend, Dan Bornstein. Dan, please say hello to my podcast people.
Hello, podcast people.
Oh, I love the enthusiasm. I love it. Well, Dan, I always start my podcast with 3 rapid fire questions that I hope to elucidate a little bit of background about my guests. Are you ready for my questions?
Fire away.
All right. Who is Dan Bornstein?
I think it depends upon who you ask.
Good answer.
So you're asking me. So I would say I'm a dad to 2 teenagers. I'm a husband to my adoring wife. I'm a son and son-in-law. I am trained, I guess, as an exercise scientist and public health person. I'm an aspiring rock musician and a former, because I think this will be relative to your audience, relevant to your audience, a former volunteer firefighter.
I need to hear more about the aspiring rock musician. Please elaborate.
Thought I might. So I used to live in Charleston, South Carolina, and I was in a band called Kabuki Love Machine, where I was a drummer. We actually had 2 drummers, so I was one of the 2 drummers, and I did lead and backup vocals. And we just played the music that we grew up with, so like 70s, 80s, 90s rock and roll, and it was awesome. Like, it was just awesome. We were okay. We weren't awesome as, musically awesome, but we had a great time together. We gigged, not too often, maybe once every 2 months or so. But it was just a total getaway from everything else in my life. And it was making music together with other people is one of life's great joys. So, and I've moved to Vermont about 1.5 years ago, and I don't have a band yet. So that is a big vortex in my life right now.
I do not know if Scott Caulfield plays an instrument, but I really think you need to be in a band with him. More to follow. All right, Dan, what sets your soul on fire?
Well, aside from playing rock and roll music, I'm a total adrenaline junkie. I think that's part of why I became a firefighter. Was I really did, this, right? That when the pager goes off or the alarm bell goes off, the adrenaline starts pumping, no matter what kind of scene you're going to. So when I gave up firefighting, I got into high performance driving. And so I'm also a high performance driving instructor, and I was an amateur race car driver for a little while. So anything that gets my heart like pumping. So downhill skiing also, now that I live in Vermont, is kind of an adrenaline rush. So that's the kind of stuff that sets my soul on fire on like the fun side of things. On the professional side of things, what sets my soul on fire is being a professional dot connector. So finding some group or some individual who's doing something really, really cool over here, and then another person or organization that's doing something really, really cool over there, And I can see how if the two of them came together, that sparks would fly and they would be able to do so much better and do so much more together. That also, like professionally, totally sets my soul on fire. So I've sort of, I guess, coined myself a professional dot connector.
I like that. I am professional glue. So I do sort of the same thing that you do, but I don't connect the dots. I glue the people together. Who knew we had all these things in common, Dan? Wow.
Who knew?
Who knew? And the race car driving. You are just blowing my mind right now. All right. Last question, rapid fire. How are you changing the world?
On a daily basis, by trying to make people smile. I think that's, my wife once asked me, like one night in bed, like, why do you think you were put on this earth? It was like a Tuesday night. And I was like, wow, that's a fine time for a question like this. But what was so weird was that without even giving it any thought, it was almost like my soul was speaking. Like I didn't process it at all cognitively. I just said to make people smile. So on a daily basis, it's making people smile. But really it's about trying, ultimately professionally for me, it's largely about trying to increase physical activity levels across the entire population so that we can improve population physical health, mental health, and then readiness for whatever that means, whether that's readiness for being a parent or, a duly employed professional or a member of our U.S. Armed Forces or a first responder. Readiness can mean a lot of different things, but without being sufficiently physically active, based upon my own research and also probably personal bias, it's pretty tough to be ready for life.
And we're going to dig really deep down in that rabbit hole of readiness as one of the main topics on this podcast. But before we get there, when I first met you, I think it was in 2019, but I'm not sure. When I first met you, you were fulfilling a position at the Citadel. So tell me a little bit about what you did at the Citadel. Tell me about the program you developed. Tell me all the things.
Tell you all the things. Yeah, we met, I think, at Summer Strong.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Right. So for those who have never been to or seen or heard about a Summer Strong, you owe yourself the joy of going to Summer Strong. I won't say anything more about it because I like the mystery behind it, but that's where I think we first met, because we had just sort of started rolling out the programs, the academic programs at the Citadel that I had sort of conceptualized. I didn't develop the whole thing because I had a lot of help. But what we developed there was the first ever actual academic degree and certificate programs in what we called tactical performance and resiliency. So the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, had developed their certification as a tactical strength and conditioning facilitator. But there was sort of recognition that was a necessary, but maybe not necessarily sufficient condition for being a highly effective tactical strength and conditioning professional. That there are a lot of other skills that maybe, and knowledge sets that needed to go along with that. So while I was at the Citadel, which is a military college down in South Carolina, I stood up a center there that was called the Center for Performance, Readiness, Resiliency, and Recovery. And there were three basic components of that center, one of which was academic degree and certificate programs. So we created an online undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree in tactical strength and conditioning. We developed a graduate certificate online in tactical performance and resiliency. And then we also developed a residential Master's of Science in tactical performance and resiliency. So that was the academic side of what I was doing while I was there.
And that was one of, if not the only program like that in the country at the time, right?
Yeah, it was the first It was the first ever. I don't think it's the only one now, which is a good thing because there's a lot more need for education in this space. So, but yes, at the time it was the first and only. Yeah.
Outstanding. Well, what I wanted to really talk to you about today, I've heard you speak about this a couple times. I heard you speak about it at Tactical Annual this year with Dr. Dawes. The lack of fitness becoming a national security issue. This is really intriguing to me, and I think it's potentially something that my listeners have never even considered might impact the candidates that are coming into the fire service. So tell me first, what does this even mean?
What does this even mean? Can I back up even further?
Heck yes, you can.
and talk about how we even got to this idea that low physical activity or low physical fitness might actually be a national security issue.
Back up the truck. Let's talk about it.
All right. Yep. So I was getting my Ph.D. at the University of South Carolina, and it was a Ph.D. in exercise science, but with an emphasis on sort of physical activity and health. So yes, I was studying some, mechanistic and cellular level exercise physiology, but the overall emphasis was, like I was talking about earlier, trying to increase population levels of physical activity. And at the time, I was also working as a graduate student on a project called the U.S. National Physical Activity Plan, which was like a strategic plan to do what it sounds like, increase population levels of physical activity. And we had decades of really good science on the importance of physical activity for health, and also how physical inactivity is associated with many non-communicable and now even communicable diseases like COVID, right? We saw that there was this pretty strong correlation between low physical fitness and poorer outcomes from COVID. So we had, again, decades of evidence, but this persistent decline in the physical activity levels of the population. So there was this disconnect, right? Like, well, how is it that we have all this science, but the problem's getting worse? And then I took a class in health promotion, and the class was about messaging and framing in public health. So how do you frame or talk about a particular problem? And the class was being taught by a professor who I love. He's fantastic. His name is Jim Thrasher. So shout out to Jim Thrasher at the University of South Carolina. But his area of expertise was actually in tobacco control policy. And what I learned in his class was that what led to the significant drop in smoking in the US and the subsequent precipitous drop in lung cancer in this country was not the evidence on the harmful effects of smoking to the smoker, but the harmful effects of secondhand smoke. So in essence, what was happening was you had all this science that said smoking was really bad for you, but that wasn't enough for any kind of policy change to try to limit that behavior. But when the evidence on the harmful effects of secondhand smoke became evident, that's when you saw the federal government and even, local municipal governments stepping in and saying, we're going to limit your access to cigarettes. We're going to put Surgeon General's warnings on packages of cigarettes, and we're going to tax cigarettes, and we're going to limit where you can even use them, right? You can no longer smoke in the workplace or on airplanes and so on, and in bars and so on and so forth. And so basically what you did was you changed the environments, making it really difficult to access the thing that was negatively impacting not only individuals and their own health, but the health of others. And so it was in that moment, as I was studying this stuff, that I kind of went, okay, we know that physical inactivity is really bad for the individual, and physical activity is really good for the individual. What is the secondhand smoke equivalent? How is physical inactivity, how is my being physically inactive adversely affecting other people. And that's when I started doing research on the physical fitness levels of recruits entering the military and the associations between low fitness and musculoskeletal injuries that were taking place during basic training and then following service members over the course of their careers and then even into veteran status, and how much that was costing the Department of Defense and the VA. And so that's when I sort of had this idea that I think we need to reframe physical inactivity as not necessarily a public health issue, but as a national security issue. And so that's sort of that relationship. And again, the problem is getting worse, right? As we're seeing physical activity levels and fitness levels still continuing to decline, we see that this year, for example, the U.S. Army fell short of its recruiting goal by approximately 20,000 soldiers.
Wow.
And so what does that mean? It means that we're going to have a smaller army. It means that selection processes for things like special operation forces, those things may decline as well. They're having trouble filling their ranks. And you're just going to have this trickle-down effect. And I know the same is true across the fire service and also in law enforcement. It's getting harder and harder and harder to find individuals who not only have the desire or propensity to serve, whether that's serving their country in the U.S. Armed Forces or serving their community as a first responder, but they also lack the fitness to serve. So finding individuals who have both is becoming increasingly more challenging, and that poses very real and very present threats to our national security, but also our state and local safety and security.
Absolutely. And as you were talking about the tremendous expense for the military on these soldiers or other military members that they're hiring, the dollar signs just started, fling, fling, fling in my head. Is that number in the millions? Is it in the billions?
It's in the billions. It's in the billions.
Lord.
Yeah, it's in the billions. So because there's not only just the direct medical cost for treating the injury as it happens, let's call it an ankle sprain or maybe it's shin splints or something like that. There's the direct medical cost, but then there's also the indirect costs. So there's taking the person out of, in the fire service would be putting them on limited duty, basically. Or maybe they get processed out of the military. And the amount of time and money that you've spent on training that person, now all that is lost. So when you start adding these dollars up, they're in the tens of billions of dollars per year for the DoD, and then it just moves on to the VA as they have to treat the residual effects of these musculoskeletal injuries that were sustained over the course of a service member's career. So it is a major economic issue, but it's also a practical issue from the standpoint of just having enough people who are fit enough to go out and do the job.
Well, and not only, I think this was your analogy, we're all dipping from the same well. So police, fire, and military agencies are all trying to hire from the same well. Historically, many of the police officers and firefighters were former military members. So that pipeline, especially if there's so many of them getting injured and processed out, that pipeline is getting shut down as well. That's very concerning.
It is. It is. It's really concerning. We can either act or not act on the problem. And if we don't act on the problem by really putting resources behind it, then frankly, we really do so at our own peril. I mean, truly, truly at our own peril. And that might sound hyperbolic, but but it's really not hyperbole. It's a reality that when that alarm bell sounds, there might not be enough people to answer the bell, or anybody to answer the bell. And I see that in my own hometown right now, my new hometown of Norwich, Vermont, which is a small town in the middle of Vermont. There's not a whole lot of crime, but there's one police officer right now. And we were without any police officers for a short time. We have a volunteer fire department. The chief has called me a few times asking if I'll join again. And it's been so long, I'd have to go through the academy, and I'm 50 and I'm not sure I want to do that.
Oh,
but
you don't.
but they're I think they're down to 12 firefighters.
Well, not to bring up Scott Caulfield
scary.
again, but he was a firefighter in the Navy. So let's go, Scott.
Yeah, he's too far away though. So it's weird. I live in Norwich, Vermont, which is not where Norwich University is, which is crazy because Norwich University is in Vermont. But it's actually, Norwich University is actually like 40 miles north of me in a town called Northfield, Vermont.
Well, let's make things complicated.
Scott's response time for the Norwich Village Fire Department would be a little too long.
A little too long.
But for Northfield Fire Department, he could certainly.
All right,
sign
Northfield, if you're listening, Scott Caulfield. Find him at the
He's your guy.
At the school. He's your guy. Look for Alfie
He's
too.
your guy.
So
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken, you have actually addressed Congress about this issue. So, and you said we need to act on the problem, or not act, but that's going to cause a lot of peril. So when you addressed Congress, what did you have to say to them?
Basically what, I said a lot of what I've just said now. So, you can't just come to somebody with problems. You've got to come with solutions as well. So the context in which I had the opportunity to brief Congress, I've done it twice. But the most recent one was to release formally a new this new military settings sector of the National Physical Activity Plan. So I had mentioned that earlier when I was at University of South Carolina. I was working on the development of this National Physical Activity Plan, which at the time was organized around 8 different societal sectors. Like there was an education sector, and there was a transportation sector, and there was a public health sector, and again, all these areas that can influence physical activity levels. But about 2-ish years ago, I was sort of tapped on the shoulder and asked if I would develop a new sector, chair the group to develop a new sector on military settings. And so we did that, and we officially launched the military settings sector in the context of a congressional briefing. So basically, yes, what we were saying to Congress at that time was the Army is facing some serious recruiting challenges, and we had some of the generals from Army's training and doctrine command talking about some of those challenges, but also talking about some of the ways in which they're addressing those challenges. Once somebody gets into the Army through the Army's what's called Holistic Health and Fitness Program, or H2F, which I know you're familiar with, and some of your listeners may be as well. I was talking about it, again, in the context more globally of how we compare to other nations. And so one of the last slides, for example, that I had was a slide of U.S. Army soldiers, marching in formation, and a group of Chinese soldiers marching in formation, with research-based statistics showing that for every one Army soldier that gets injured in basic training, there are 2 male and 3 female U.S. Army soldiers who get injured in basic training. And China is by far our greatest adversary. It just is. And so if we don't do something about this, it's going to be a problem. I mean, at some point, we may unfortunately have to face China on the battlefield. And if we don't start addressing the issue by really resourcing physical activity and fitness and the other domains of health, mental health and spiritual health and cognitive health and so on. But we were specifically talking about physical activity and physical fitness at that time. Then we're going to lose. I mean, that's the reality. The reality is we will no longer be the world's number one superpower. I don't know enough to know exactly what that means from a total geopolitical perspective. But it'll become the reality.
So, Dan, is part of the answer, because I remember as a child when I was, grade school, even middle school, not so much in high school, but definitely grade school and middle school, I had gym class 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. Is that the answer? Going back and saying, we messed this up. We need to put gym class back into the school system. Or is at least that part of the answer?
Yeah. Hard, yes. I mean, that is definitely part of the answer. So what we've done in essence is we have engineered physical activity out of our lives in many different ways, right? So our ability to live our life, when you think about how we live today compared to how we lived 50 or 100 or 150 years ago, we had to be physically active to survive 150 years ago. Now we don't. And when you look at how our public school systems have been set up over the last 15 to 20 years, there has been policy, federal policy, that has put priority around reading and math and some of the core academic subjects. Why? Because we were falling behind other nations. So this emphasis on these core, quote unquote, academic subjects and the standardized testing to assess ability around those core academic subjects meant that other things got deprioritized. Other things being physical education, music, drama, and other things that we know also really develop the human being. But yes, physical education has been stripped out of a significant portion of the educational experience, K through 12. And as a result, you have a population of people who have much lower what we would call physical literacy, ability to actually use their bodies, and they have much lower physical fitness. In the military, so Colonel Kevin Bigelman with U.S. Army, who's basically running the H2F program, one of his lines is, if you can't throw a baseball, how are you going to be able to throw a grenade?
Touche,
right? I mean, and I see some kids nowadays, and I look at how they run or I look at how they throw, and it's a little embarrassing. But there's also more to it than that, right? So there used to be more opportunities to walk and bike to school. But because of land and land costs, schools are now, the town where I live in now, the school is like right in the center of town. And there are tons of kids that walk and bike to school. And the same was true when I lived in South Carolina. But there are a lot of schools that are located 5, 7, 10 miles from town or from where people live. So they've got to get on a bus to go to school. You can't walk or bike to school anymore, or it's not safe because there aren't safe sidewalks or what have you. So again, our whole transportation system has been engineered to primarily serve single occupant vehicles. There's been almost no attention paid to those who are trying to get from point A to point B by walking or biking or rolling, if they're not an able-bodied person. So again, we have an entire system, a transportation system that has been engineered to not account for physical activity. You have an entire educational system that has stripped away physical education and opportunities for physical activity. You have a healthcare system that is set up to treat disease rather than prevent disease. But there are signs for hope. I mean, there are efforts. There's something called Complete Streets. There's a Complete Streets Coalition, which talks about how you can actually engineer or reverse engineer streets in cities and towns to accommodate pedestrians, cyclists, cars, buses, what have you, in a very safe way. You've got medical schools that are incorporating courses in physical activity and nutrition as part of becoming a medical doctor.
Praise be, and finally.
Yeah, is it pervasive? No. These are like exceptions to the rule more so than they are the rule. But in education, we still don't have the type of policies that are going to ultimately change the system such that physical education becomes a part of every child's day and or week. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it is a huge part of the problem.
And as you were talking about all of those nice things that we've engineered to make our lives so easy, it reminded me of, again, I brought up this book, The Comfort Crisis, in episode 16 with George Carvajal. Have you read that book, Dan?
No, I haven't, but I'm going to go out and read it.
It's really good. But one of the main points from the book is that our lifespan is longer than it's ever been, but our health span is shorter. And everything we do, most of us, everything we do is in an effort to make things easier and more comfortable for ourselves. So there's just no struggle for us anymore. And there's no challenge for us physically. So yeah, definitely. Michael Easter is the author.
Yeah, no, I will definitely check it out. And that reminds me of a term that I used to teach when I was at the Citadel. And I taught a course called Physical Activity and National Security, where exercise science meets political science. And we talked in that class about the concept of compressed morbidity. And that concept of compressed morbidity, which sounds a lot like what you're describing, is that, from a healthcare perspective and a cost for treating disease perspective, the person who has the lowest drain on the healthcare system is the person who essentially never sees the doctor for any disease or what have you, but they just suddenly die. So the example I used to give to my students was, you've got this like 98-year-old person, no diabetes, no heart disease, no anything, none of these chronic diseases, right? They maybe go for a wellness check once a year. And they've maintained a super active lifestyle, so they're jogging across the street and get hit by a truck and die. So in terms of the drain that they've put on the healthcare system, it's close to zero. Compared to somebody who at age 13 now gets diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which is an incredibly expensive disease to treat, and they're a type 2 diabetic for 50 or 60 years. I mean, that never used to happen. I mean, type 2 diabetes, which is a lifestyle disease, was a disease even 20 years ago that was essentially a disease of people who were 50 and over. And now it's a disease that's quite common among even teens and preteens.
Gosh.
So again, when we think about, when we talk about national security and so on, here's a little nugget too that, it's a little bit more indirect, but when people say, what do you mean? What's this association between sort of physical activity and health and national security? Well, if you look at the percent of the GDP, our gross domestic product, that we spend on health expenditures, it's almost 18% of our GDP.
Unbelievable.
When you compare that to our military expenditures, the annual budget for the National Defense Authorization Act, that's more usually between 3 and 4% of GDP. So when we start talking about our ability, again, to compete with some of our greatest near-peer adversaries like China and others, and we start falling behind not just in the planes and tanks and bombs that we have, but in the warfighters that we have, if we could somehow save a whole bunch of money on what we're spending on treating these non-communicable, preventable lifestyle diseases and put them into either education or our military, we'd be in a much better place. But right now, that's not the priority.
I absolutely agree. And ironically or coincidentally, I had a phone conversation with one of my coworkers today. I don't often speak to him. He's on a different shift, but we always have great conversations. And so he called me today, like a savage. Who calls? Anyway, but shout out to Marty, because his question was this. I have this 9 and 11-year-olds, these two children, and they play baseball. And the older kid, he can crush 25 push-ups and a whole bunch of pull-ups. And he was just telling me all the things they did together. And he said, is it safe for him to start lifting some weights, or is he too young? And I said, with supervision and really keeping control of how much weight and his form, it's perfectly safe. But I just thought, Marty, you are such a damn good dad. You're doing you're modeling these behaviors. They see you go to the gym and they're interested in what you're doing, and they're modeling your behavior. The whole family does circuits together, but that's not the norm. And so how do we reach these children, other than gym class, but how do we reach these children that are growing up in homes where family dinner is McDonald's 4 nights a week, where family leisure time is screens and TVs? How do we reach these children, Dan? Because the parents, I don't think we can reach the parents.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I hate to give up on an entire generation or sets of generations. So there's a really important model in public health that any of your listeners, or maybe you can put it in the chat notes or whatever, it's called the social ecological model, or socio-ecological model. But basically what that model demonstrates is that at the very center is an individual, the individual's knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior. So imagine a circle, right? And that circle is this individual and their knowledge, skills, attitudes. And let's say it's around physical activity and health. If you go, there are concentric circles that move out from that center circle that is the individual. And those concentric circles have a very significant impact on that individual's knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior. And the first circle that's outside of that initial one is the social environment. Your parents, your friends, your colleagues, what have you, right? So if you're hanging out with a bunch of drug addicts and drinkers, that old saying, you are the company you keep, is very true. So the example of your friend calling you today is a great example of setting up a social environment that is significantly altering the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors of those children. And then if you move out from there, from that social environment, you get to what's called the physical or built environment. So, maybe this guy's really dedicated and he's got a gym, in his garage, or he takes them to a gym, or he's got some equipment or what have you. So he creates this physical environment that's supportive. And remember, we were talking earlier about like transportation infrastructure. Well, there's some places where it's frankly not even safe to go outside, or at least the perception is that it's not safe to go outside. So that's the built environment. And then on top of that is what's called the policy environment. And policy could be, it could be an elementary school principal. So policy is really like, again, it depends. There's like little p policy makers, which are, let's say it's a business owner or a school's principal. And then there are big P policymakers who are legislators, right, at state or federal levels. But they determine the environment. So a policy can change the physical environment, the social environment, and then the individual knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors. So as it relates to kids, I don't think we should rule out parents as a huge opportunity to influence behavior of children. And so there's a lot that can be done there. And there's a lot that can be done in schools. So, let's talk about a faith-based setting. So that's another setting within this National Physical Activity Plan. There are lots of Americans who practice a faith, no matter what it is, and maybe go somewhere to do it. And there could be that's a tremendous opportunity, right? There's a lot of trust in our faith leaders. And you even see, right, that there are even some organizations that use the connection to the faith as an opportunity to bring people together to exercise. So there are all these opportunities to interact with the environments in which our kids interact. So that could be school, and school's a good one because they spend a lot of time there, right? That's where they spend the majority of their time. So if you were going to forego parents, then yes, going to schools and changing the environments in and around schools to support what we would call comprehensive school physical activity programs, which is, yes, physical education is a cornerstone of that, but also opportunities to have what I would call a free range classroom. So when I was a college professor, it said in my syllabus that sitting was discouraged, that you were encouraged to get up and move around the classroom as long as you weren't interrupting somebody else's learning, right? But I would have students stretching or doing jumping jacks in the back of the classroom or whatever, just because we know that a short bout of physical activity actually improves your cognition. It improves your ability to be focused and your time on task. So, so Annette, I wouldn't want to rule out parents because we know that they have such a strong influence over their children's behavior. And I think if we are going to have our biggest bang for the buck, then I would say, yes, we want to intervene on schools. And if the goal is to improve physical activity and fitness of a population that has a higher propensity to serve their country or their city or state, then I would, if somebody asked me where should I spend my money, I would say spend it on DoD schools or DoD connected students, because these are children of parents who are already propensed to serve their country. So again, when we look at our parents as role models, you could say the same thing, for firefighters and law enforcement officers, right? There are legacy law enforcement officers and firefighters. They do what mom or dad did because they saw what it was, they believed that it was cool, and so on. So yeah, schools are a great place to do it, and DoD connected schools, again, I would say would be our greatest bang for the buck.
Well, I'm going to throw you a curveball from way out and see what you can do with this, Dan.
Swing and a miss.
Swing and a miss.
No, I'll try.
All right. For years, and I only can speak specifically to Illinois, but for years, we had hundreds and sometimes thousands of applicants for a firefighting job. And because of the way it works, it's a testing process, it's an ordered list. It could be a list of 200 people, and that department may not even hire anyone in the 2 years that list is good. So people were just praying for opportunities. So many people wanted the job. And we've seen this shift in the last few years for many different reasons. One, the pension system was changed in Illinois. I think that makes the job a little bit less desirable. I think the fact that younger people are way smarter than we were at that age, and so they're making comparisons. Okay, I could go fight fires and not sleep at night and maybe fall through a floor and maybe die, or I could be an investment banker. I think I'll go be an investment banker. So I think those are two of the issues. And then also this physical fitness issue does come into play. There are some people who truly want to do the job who are unable due to their lack of physical fitness. So given all those variables, put them in a shaker, shake it up and hand it to you. Dan, what do you see as some ways that we can, or I can, make a difference in my cosm in a
Yeah.
short amount of time?
Yeah. First off, I would say that if you're an individual who's already living a healthy lifestyle, you're eating relatively well, you're sleeping relatively well, you're regularly physically active, I believe you have an obligation in service to your community and your country to be a champion for healthy lifestyles in your community. Going into the schools, going into the firehouses, going into the places of worship, and being a leader, being a spark plug, being a champion where you live, work, play, pray, and so on. So I would say, consider yourself deputized, a deputy of healthy living and active living. Like, go ahead, put the badge on and go to work.
Nice.
So I would say that's number one, right? And that's you, right? I mean, that's something that you do, right? You've taken care of it for yourself, and now you're taking care of so many other firefighters. But anybody can do that, right? You don't have to be a certified strength and conditioning specialist or have a bachelor's or master's degree in exercise science. Just go out, because physical activity, and I think another really important thing for people to understand that's really misunderstood in this country is the difference between physical activity and exercise.
Yes.
So there are so many reasons to be averse to exercise. Exercise is structured, planned, usually relatively high intensity physical activity that requires maybe going someplace special, changing your clothes, sweating, having self-efficacy or a good understanding of what you're going to do, and then probably being pretty uncomfortable and carving out the time to do it. Those are significant barriers. And you can remove a lot of those barriers when you realize that exercise is a form of physical activity, but physical activity itself is anything that isn't sitting. So even standing, you're actually using postural muscles that you don't use when you're sitting. So when you're standing, you're actually expending more energy and training some of those postural muscles to help you maintain good posture. But take it just a step further, literally and figuratively. Take some physical activity breaks. If you've been sitting at a desk for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, get up and do 30 seconds of jumping jacks or marching in place or what have you. So breaking up sedentary time. And I call that physical activity snacking, by the way.
Love that term.
So finding ways to snack on physical activity throughout your day is really important. So gardening is physical activity. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator is physical activity. Parking further away at the mall or the grocery store is physical activity. Taking your dog for a walk is physical activity. Playing with your kids is physical activity. Ping pong, playing pool, all this stuff is physical activity. And it counts. It all really does count. And it matters with respect to your health, physical and mental health. So getting back to how do we sort of solve this problem of people not, signing up to serve. I think it's a physical activity issue, and I think I'm trying to remember. Can you ask me the question? I got tangential. So can you throw me the curveball question again? Sorry to do
Absolutely.
That
so we, as a fire service, are having so many fewer applicants.
Yeah.
Pension program.
Okay.
That.
Yep. Got it. Okay. So I think another thing that I'm now starting to encourage the Department of Defense to start to do, and I think that the fire service could do the same thing. It's got to be able to back up this statement. But we oftentimes, when we think about service members or veterans, we think of them as broken. And we do in some ways have a system that does break them. But what if the system was the opposite? What if the system was set up not to break them, but to keep them healthy and strong? So I know that, sleep cycles get disturbed when you're doing shift work and so on. And that there are elements of the job in the fire service that are inherently risky and unhealthy. Those things notwithstanding, there are ways in which you can create systems and environments within firehouses that ultimately will help somebody maintain their health, not only during the course of their time as a firefighter, but for years and years afterwards. But it's up to the leadership of the fire service to create the policies and systems and environments in those firehouses to take care of the firefighters. So again, at the individual level, if you've already got it locked in, go be a champion, go be a deputy of physical activity and healthy lifestyle. And if you're in a leadership position in the fire service, you should be that agent of change for policies and systems and environments that are going to help your firefighters. And then from a recruiting perspective, you can say, why not join an organization where you not only get to serve your community, but it's an organization that's truly going to take care of you physically, mentally, nutritionally, spiritually for the entire time that you serve, and is going to set you up for a healthy life for the years after service.
Dan, you're warming my heart right now. That is the key. And I would encourage you to drop the mic, but first, I want to ask if there's any parting comments that you would like to leave the listeners with, or would you rather just drop the mic?
I'm going to drop the mic. I've been told I talk too much. So if you're encouraging me to say drop the mic, I'm going to drop the mic.
Dan, you're amazing. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I regret that we had to reschedule because you were so sick, but I am so glad that you are feeling better. And Dan, is it okay if I put your contact information in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. So, and you have that, right?
I do.
Yeah.
So my listeners, I appreciate you so much. Please, you have now been deputized to be agents of change for health and wellness. And with that, AZ and Dan are officially out.